Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Eagle Forum YouTube channel. I'm Colleen Holcomb here with Schlafly Cori. We're here today to talk about episode 4 of Mrs. America. This episode focuses on, it's entitled Betty, focused on Betty Friedan. In this episode, we see the infamous debate between Betty Friedan and Phyllis Schlafly, in which Ms. Friedan told Phyllis that she was an Aunt Tom and a traitor to her sex. Anne, what was your reaction to this episode?
Well, they set up two different styles of mothering. So we see my mother mothering me, and we see Betty mothering her daughter. And they're two very different scenes. And you get the impression that my mother was a bully and a cruel mother because she is shown as trying to throw me in the pool and keep me underwater. Nothing could be further from the truth. As I've mentioned before, my mother was a coddling mother. She was not a bully of a mother. And then on the other side, we see Betty being a very attentive mother to her daughter, and they have a little disagreement about what they're going to wear and the stepmother, but everything comes to resolution and happiness with Betty and her daughter. Now, I don't know anything about Betty Friedan and her daughter, but I do know about my mother and me, and I think this effort to show Phyllis as a bully to those who were inferior to her is a thread that they have, because it's set up by her husband bullying Phyllis. Now, I don't think that was possible either, but I think they had this idea that Phyllis was abused and she turned around and abused others because that was the only thing she knew how to do it. And then further on, when we get into the debate, Phyllis is very cruel and bullying to Betty, and that's what causes Betty to lose her temper. Now, anyone who ever saw my mother debated knows that she never engaged in personal attacks, ever.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And again, we see your father, like you said, as a bully, but specifically trying to provoke her to, in fact, making her cry by bringing up her parents' situation and the difficult financial times that they went through. I've seen from some
Which is
other...
not true. I mean, they've made that up out of whole cloth. The idea that there was a difficult financial situation with my mother's mother. My mother's mother was an educated person who wanted this job.
And your father did not teach your mother to debate by abusing her, as you mentioned. Is that right?
Well, that's no way to teach anyone anything if they're going to have success in life. And I think, my mother was rather famous for not crying. So making up this episode where she seems to lose control and cry also is a fundamental misunderstanding of her.
There was an accusation, the show begins with the feminists making a pact to not give Phyllis any attention. And then there's this accusation made that Phyllis and the Stop ERA organization accepted money from the John Birch Society. And then there was, then Betty said, and if that's the case, she must have some white sheets in her closet. Can you
Once again, trying to pull the race card.
Right, exactly. Can you respond to those accusations?
Yes. My mother was not funded by anybody. There was always this idea that there must be some big insurance man or some big corporate executive who was secretly funding Phyllis Schlafly. Well, if you knew how Phyllis Schlafly worked, she worked on a shoestring. She didn't need any funding because that wasn't how she operated. Her office was in her home. Her staff was minimal, and she certainly never hired any high-priced consultants to get her message out because she did it herself. So I think the idea that there must have been some secret funding misunderstands the dedication that she had just to do her work. But no, the John Birch Society never funded Phyllis, nor any of those other organizations. There wasn't a secret, corporate executive behind it all, because all that says is that it's trying to make the idea that a woman couldn't do this on her own. Well, let me tell you, a woman did do it on her own.
We know that. It's getting into one of the next episodes, but there's a scene where Gloria Steinem is talking to an attorney at the Justice Department, and he's talking about how Phyllis managed to polarize the fight around the Equal Rights Amendment. And Gloria Steinem said she's a puppet of special interests. And the attorney said, well, the special interests aren't baking the pies. And Gloria Steinem said, well, they're certainly paying for the flour. And as we all know, that was never the case. As you mentioned, Phyllis was able to do an amazing amount with dedication.
Well, I remember we had one eagle, Vicky, what was Vicky's last name, who used to bake lamb cakes every Easter as a fundraiser. And this guy, and she made a fair amount of money that was donated to Eagle Forum on her baking these cakes in the shape of a lamb. And when the feminists wrote about it, they got confused, and they said in the newsletter that Vicky had sent her recipe to Phyllis as opposed to sending her receipts to Phyllis. So sometimes things get lost in translation.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, but clearly there was no, right, as all of us know, Eagle Forum is a purely grassroots organization and always has been, and there is no—
And volunteer.
And that's right, and a completely volunteer organization. As we've mentioned before, Carol Felsenthal, who was not a fan of Phyllis's, she was a reporter in St. Louis who was interested in, frankly, in digging up dirt on Phyllis.
Reporter in Chicago, just to clarify.
Okay, thank you, yeah. She sounded like she had a St. Louis accent. I heard one of her interviews. But she mentioned in her book, she was very frank about the fact that she was actively looking for dirt on Phyllis. And she said she was about to give up when Betty Friedan called a news conference to announce that in conjunction with several news organizations, that's in quotes, she was investigating charges that Schlafly and Stop ERA received funds from the John Birch Society and the Ku Klux Klan. Schlafly denied that she had ever received a dime from either. And I hate the fact that they butcher all of Phyllis's great one-liners and all of her great quotes. They tend to neuter them just like they do the men in the show. But Phyllis said, I hope Ms. Friedan spends her time investigating me. She won't find anything and it might keep her out of mischief, Schlafly commented, as usual getting the last word. I had high hopes for Friedan's investigation, but like mine and many others, it fizzled. Now, do you remember when this press conference was called, do you remember these efforts to accuse your mother of accepting money from various organizations?
Oh, yes. And throughout the 70s, the idea on the feminist side is we can't be losing to this woman in Southern Illinois. There must be some great big power behind it. That how could we be losing to her? And of course, what they miss is that my mother did have a great big power behind her, and that was her faith in Jesus Christ.
That's absolutely right. And Phyllis was always the first one to give credit to the Lord as it was due. And that's right. I remember that great quote by Eleanor Smeal when the Equal Rights Amendment was defeated in Illinois in 1980. And she said, there's something powerful against us, and I don't mean people.
Well, you know, my mother had always had pithy quotes, as you said, and she believed in working hard. And one of her other quotes was to encourage people to work. You know, yes, pray, but you can't count on God to stuff the ballot box. That's something you have to go do.
That's exactly right. Well, do you remember when that debate with Betty Friedan took place, and do you remember your mother's reaction to it?
I don't, because that debate was early on. I think it was in 1973, and it was not videoed, so there is no visual of that debate. All we have are the newspaper articles that were written about it and my mother's memories. But for my mother, it was a big moment in her life because she used that quote that Betty Friedan actually said to her, "You're a witch, and I want to burn you at the stake," as showing the intemperance of the other side that wanted to throw insults rather than talk about the issues of the moment.
And she was so masterful at taking the truth, taking what the opponent said, and and they would say using it against them, but really it was just a matter of telling the truth. And that's one of the reasons she was so effective. Well, we're looking forward to, there's a lot more to come in the next several episodes, and I look forward to talking with you more about these issues. So thank you so much, Anne, for being with us today.
You're welcome, Colleen.